How trauma holds us back from achieving our ultimate dream lives. Hi, my name is Leah Chantel. Welcome back to my channel. And today I'm tackling one of the biggest blocks that stops us from achieving our dreams, whether it's a happy, long-term committed relationship or wealth we're trying to achieve or career success. The things that often block us from achieving those big goals or dreams in our lives are themes related to trauma and negativity. And our inner negativity, when it's not acknowledged, actually blocks us from the bigger goals in our life. And I'm going to explain why that is in a minute. But first of all, I'd like to explain that sometimes trauma is something we experience, but we're not consciously admitting what has happened to ourselves. And when we don't consciously admit that we're being traumatized when we actually are, that is probably the biggest block of all that stops us from achieving our dream lives. So I'll give you a couple of examples of how we can be traumatized without being aware of it. You might think, well, of course I should be aware of trauma. How could I not be aware of being traumatized? So let's say, for example, you've had a traumatic childhood, but everyone around you really admires your parents and sees them as upstanding members of the community and everybody's friends with them. You may kind of tell yourself a narrative that whatever happened when you were in childhood, although you may have been traumatized a few times, was actually your own fault, and it wasn't the fault of the rest of your family. And then you rewrite your own history as, of course, I wasn't traumatized. It was something else. So when we rewrite our own history like that, sometimes it's very helpful to do that. But if we're really in denial over things that happened to us as a child, we're actually prone to experiencing trauma and having repeats of that history over and over again as adults. So it's a very dangerous thing to do, to kind of idealize your own childhood and pretend that your life was perfect when you were a child. And I mean, it's tempting to do because in your community, you're really rewarded sometimes for doing that. People don't always like to hear about the real life story of how you grew up. They much prefer to hear the rose-colored glasses version that allows them to idealize your family because they like your family. And I mean, it's okay to be strategic in your conversations and to not necessarily share your vulnerabilities with people who may not appreciate you sharing that kind of information. I think that's very smart strategically, but you can take that a step too far and kind of rewrite your own history like everything was okay back then when really it wasn't. So that's the number one way your trauma may never even come to the surface, and you may not even realize you've been traumatized. And then there's the unconscious belief is running your whole life and not allowing you to take risks when maybe you should be. The number two way you could be experiencing trauma without even realizing it is that you could be very traumatized by a relationship, either with a romantic partner that you've justified in your mind as being your soulmate. And so when they behave badly, you're not even really aware of it. You just tolerate it because you evaluate the relationship so much. And when you've experienced trauma as a child and you've written your own history as everything is okay, you're more likely to experience this kind of romantic relationship as an adult. And it's the same at work. So we do have these long-term committed relationships with our bosses, and we do need to find ways to get along with them in order to be a productive member of society. However, we can gaslight ourselves and tell us that our bosses are just, really stressed out or they have very little sleep when really they're treating us disrespectfully. And you need to tell the truthful story to yourself, at least. I get not necessarily sharing it with your immediate family or your coworkers if they're not that supportive and they don't really have the tools to help you with that situation. That's completely okay to keep things private, but you don't want to disguise the truth from yourself. It's very important that you have a grip on your own reality, and you can do that through writing in a journal privately and keeping it in a secured place where prying eyes are not going to read it inappropriately. And then you have a grasp on your own reality that you are being traumatized by your boss. And the first step to getting over trauma is you have to acknowledge that the trauma has happened. So these are kind of more emotional ways that trauma happens. There are other ways. So trauma obviously can happen physically. So if you've had a car accident, that's a very obvious trauma that you have to process and get over. And the one good thing about a car accident is, although it's not a good thing to have one and to get injured, when you do experience one and you explain it to other people actually immediately understand. It's not like our relationships where it can be difficult to share our traumas in them because people don't understand which side of the story they should be on, or they may think everybody should be positive and they shouldn't be sharing anything negative about family or workplace, etc. And so it can be very difficult to find spaces to share that kind of trauma safely. The good thing about a physical trauma is that it's actually relatively easy and straightforward to share that with other people and to get support. So that's one of the reasons why, as a social media influencer, one of the first stories I shared with other people is my story about Guillain-Barré syndrome. So at that time, my immune system didn't perform properly and it started attacking my nervous system, which rendered me paralyzed for a while, and I had to work very hard. It was a very traumatizing experience in order to get my body back. And if you've ever done a hard workout, and I've done several in my life, I've been very physically active, but if you ever have to learn how to walk again, that is the hardest workout you will ever do. And it's very traumatizing, A, to lose your ability to walk, and B, to get it back and fight to get it back. And I mean, I could articulate that in a lot of detail. And thankfully, I was journaling a lot. I was given a journal at that time from somebody who really cared about me. And that helped me process my trauma and pain at the time. So I was able to move past my physical pain and start working towards a worthy goal of being physically able to live my life again. And it all turned out really well. Having said that, I had to acknowledge that the trauma had happened and work through it. So with physical trauma, it's very obvious what has happened. It's like you're paralyzed, or you've had the car accident, or whatever has happened. Your body is not able to function the way it normally does. Where trauma gets a little bit more hidden is when it's emotional or possibly spiritual. Sometimes people can pass along beliefs about the afterlife or about religion that are incorrect. They may tell you that your relatives went to hell or something because they did something wrong. And those beliefs typically are not true. I mean, that's a long story and that could be a whole video in itself. But usually if somebody tries to convince you that your deceased family members are in hell for whatever reason, that's a big red flag that they're being spiritually abusive. So that's a good heads up to let you know about. So there's nothing wrong with having trauma. Where trauma gets to be a problem in people's lives is when it's not acknowledged. That's when it's like the invisible barrier that when you're trying to achieve something, you're unconsciously scared of achieving it because you think you're going to encounter some traumatic situation. And truthfully, there probably are problems in that new reality that you're aspiring for. But what happens is your unconscious makes a really big deal about the problems that are coming on the other side of it and turns them into something that are too dangerous to deal with. Having said that, when you actually get to the other side and you manifest the dream life that you want, usually the problems aren't that big of a deal. And I'll give you an example of this. So for a long time, I've wanted to manifest my dream business. But for a long time, I was really scared to go on video or go on social media for a lot of reasons. And it's complicated. But one of the reasons was there were people that I decided to cut out of my life who weren't a really great fit for me in terms of friendships or relationships. And I was nervous that some of those people would come back into my life if I started having a more public persona online. And I was actually correct about that fear, completely correct. Some people did come back into my life and I had to deal with that. And it wasn't the most fun aspect of my business. Now, having said that, I made it into a huge thing into my mind. I was so traumatized by those past experiences and those people that I kicked out of my life that I thought it was too threatening and too big of a deal to deal with. If I ever achieved my goals and started my business online. I thought I couldn't cope if those negative people came back into my life. Well, guess what? They actually did try to come back in my life. And the truth was, it was actually really easy to get rid of them. It was easy to deal with their negative comments. I found ways to help my community and protect them from trolls. And it wasn't as difficult to block them as I imagined them to be. I guess I thought I would read the messages that they'd send and I'd get all emotional. But truthfully, when I recognized their names, I just realized all I really have to do is ignore whatever message they sent and block them. And it wasn't that scary at all. But my mind had unconsciously made it into such a big deal that it was too dangerous for me to ever put a video post on the internet because so-and-so from my past could see it and then try to come back into my life. Maybe they'd find some way to look up my phone number, or they find some way to find my Facebook contact information and they would message me. And truthfully, it's just not a big deal. And it was such a silly reason to slow down and not begin posting videos on the internet, because what I was making as to be a big fear factor in my mind actually turned out to be not a big deal at all on the other side. But when we're not achieving things, there's often some kind of fear factor in the back of our minds that we haven't articulated. We're not even aware what it is, and it's controlling the results. It's controlling us and stopping us from achieving our dreams. And if we're able to kind of pull back the curtains of our unconscious mind and find those negative beliefs that are really stopping us and correct them accurately, then we're able to move forward on the projects that we're trying to manifest. And then it's not such a big deal. And truthfully, yes, there are moments where those fears do come up. Working on my business, and those negative people do pop back into my life very momentarily, and I do feel upset for like maybe a few minutes. I may message somebody I care about and say, oh, this person has come back in my life. I may have a negative moment here or there, but I'm beginning to realize it's not like even maybe 5 or 10 or 20 minutes that I'm really that upset. And then I just move on to the rest of my day and start working on things. It just was never that big of a deal. And even if you go through something that is a big deal, like you lose your ability to walk, like I did, even if you have to process trauma from that, the biggest thing is to just be aware of it when it comes up. For example, when I'm doing a yoga class, the interesting thing is when I'm doing balancing poses, so there are some days I just go into the pose and I can just do them, like I'm strong enough to do them, like a half moon pose, for example. But there are other days where it's like I'm thinking more about what had happened to me in the past and the way I felt paralyzed or how scared I was. And then I'll try to strike the pose, and then my body is just shaking. I'm just thinking like a building in an earthquake. It's like my body's shaking like a building in an earthquake that's swaying. And even when my body's swaying like that, I'll still try to kind of control my body and stay in the pose. And sometimes even with that swaying motion, my body is strong enough to stay in the pose. It's kind of like when a person is shaking when they're trying to strike that pose and they're trying to balance their bodies. Well, my body does that a lot. It shakes wildly to the point where the person next to me will look and be like really scared that I'm going to like fall or something. But having said that, it's just the way my body processes balance now after I've been through that challenging life event. But I can still pull it off. I can still do a lot of balancing poses in yoga. And if I can do that, then that just shows you that in a lot of situations, you can make it to the other side and beat your fears, but you need to become aware of what they are first. If you don't even know what it is that's bothering you, then you're not going to be able to achieve the things that you want to achieve in life. So you need to become aware. But then even when you become aware of them, don't spend too much time on them either. For example, with the social media people, when people I don't like contact me sometimes, like I do feel upset for a moment. I'm human. But the important thing is to just kick them out of my life and get rid of them as soon as possible. And usually a few minutes later, I'm not even thinking about it anymore. I'm on to the next thing. And that's the key to dealing with trauma and fear in order to move past it and work towards building your ultimate life. I hope you enjoyed my tips for today about dealing with trauma. If you have any questions, definitely feel free to make a comment or share your stories about how you've overcome certain traumatic events in your life. I'd be really curious to see that in the comments. And if you liked my stories today, definitely hit like And if you want to hear more from me in the future, definitely subscribe to my channel. I'd be really excited to get to know you. And I hope you're all having a wonderful week. Take care, everybody. Bye now.